Before the internet told you to buy a $300 survival kit, people figured things out with what was already in the house. Your grandparents didn't panic. They had a manual, a worn, dog-eared booklet stuffed in a kitchen drawer that somehow covered everything from first aid to fire, starting to preserving food through a blackout. These books don't get talked about much anymore, but they should, because tucked inside them are 15 forgotten survival tricks hidden in old household manuals. Trick 15, the newspaper insulation method. Old home economics guides from the 1940s and 50s frequently included a section on emergency insulation, and newspaper was always the first recommendation. Not as a joke, as a genuine field-tested technique used during World War II when materials were rationed and winters didn't care. The science is simple. Crumpled newspaper traps air between its layers, and trapped air is one of the best insulators there is. The old manuals instructed readers to stuff newspaper between clothing layers, particularly around the torso and thighs, before going out in extreme cold, or if heat at home failed. Post-war civil defense booklets, distributed in the US and Britain, specifically listed newspaper as a backup insulation material for sheltering in place during prolonged cold snaps. They weren't being cheap, they were being practical. A full Sunday edition crumpled and layered under a coat can meaningfully slow heat loss from the body. What made newspaper particularly useful in wartime and post-war contexts was its near-universal availability. Even in households that had very little, there was almost always a newspaper within reach. Old manuals valued materials that required no special purchase, because in a genuine emergency, the supply chain is exactly what fails first. The people writing these guides understood that the most useful tool is the one you already have. This still works. Physics hasn't changed. If you're ever stranded somewhere cold with only what's around you, newspaper in your clothes is not embarrassing, it's effective. And if anyone gives you a strange look, you can explain the thermodynamics to them while you're warm and they're not. Trick 14, using a candle to waterproof matches. Matches that don't light when you need them are arguably worse than no matches at all. At least with nothing, you know to look for another option. Damp matches give you false hope and then let you down in spectacular fashion. Household manuals from the early 20th century, particularly those aimed at rural families and campers, included a straightforward fix. Dip the heads of wooden matches in melted candle wax, let them dry, and store them in a sealed tin. The wax coating keeps moisture out completely. When you need to strike one, the friction of the matchbox surface breaks through the thin wax coating without much extra effort. Some editions of the Boy Scout Handbook from the 1920s through the 1940s also included this tip, though instructions varied slightly by edition. The principle is identical regardless of the source. Wax seals, friction breaks the seal, match lights. It costs almost nothing to do this in advance, and it means your emergency fire-starting supply is actually reliable. The sealed tin matters as much as the wax coating. Old manuals were careful to specify metal containers rather than cardboard boxes. Moisture penetrates cardboard over time, and a match tin that's been sitting in an emergency kit for 2 years in a garage has been through a lot of humidity cycles. The combination of wax-dipped heads and a tight metal container gives you matches that are genuinely ready when called upon, rather than matches that were ready when you packed them and have been slowly degrading ever since. Trick 13, charcoal as a water filter. Modern water filtration involves ceramic membranes, ultraviolet light, and reverse osmosis systems that cost more than a used car. Old manuals had charcoal. Activated charcoal specifically has been used in water purification going back centuries, but even plain wood charcoal was used in improvised filters documented in early 20th century homesteading and preparedness guides. The instructions typically called for layering charcoal, sand, and gravel in a container with a hole at the bottom, letting water pass through slowly. The layering sequence mattered. Coarse gravel on top to catch large debris, fine sand in the middle, and crushed charcoal at the bottom as the final stage before the water exited the container. This does not make water safe to drink on its own. It's not a pathogen filter. The manuals were clear about this. What it does is remove sediment, improve taste, and reduce certain chemical contaminants. In situations where boiling was also recommended, charcoal filtration was the step before boiling, not a replacement for it. The distinction matters. Old manuals were often more precise about the limits of their techniques than people give them credit for. They didn't say, charcoal makes water safe, they said it makes water cleaner, and then you boil it. That two-step approach, mechanical filtration followed by heat treatment, is still the basis of how most field water purification works today. The materials are different, but the logic is identical. There's something almost humbling about that. Trick 12. Salt as a wound cleanser and preservative. Salt shows up in old household manuals more than almost any other single ingredient. It was cheap, it kept indefinitely, and it did an astonishing number of things. For wound care, saline, salt dissolved in clean water, was the standard first aid rinse long before antiseptic sprays existed. Home first aid sections in manuals from the 1920s through the 1950s consistently recommended rinsing cuts and abrasions with a saline solution before applying any dressing. The concentration recommended was usually about 1 teaspoon of salt per pint of boiled, cooled water, close to what modern medicine still considers isotonic saline. Salt also appears in food preservation sections, which is its more famous use. Dry salting and brine curing of meat and vegetables were standard techniques for extending food supplies, particularly in households without reliable refrigeration. These manuals often included precise salt-to-water ratios for brining, drying times for salt-cured meats, and guidance on which vegetables held up best in brine versus vinegar. Beyond those two major applications, some manuals also listed salt as a basic dental care substitute. Rubbing a small amount on the gums was recommended in sections on hygiene during travel or rural life, long before toothpaste became a household staple. It's mildly abrasive and has mild antibacterial properties at high concentrations. If your refrigerator dies for a week and you have enough salt on hand, you have more options than most people realize. The old manuals knew that. Most of us have forgotten it, which is ironic, given that salt has been a survival essential for literally thousands of years across almost every human civilization on record. Trick 11, the penny and fuse trick, what not to do and why it was done. This one requires some historical context because the trick itself is genuinely dangerous and should not be replicated. But it appears in enough old household electrical manuals from the early to mid-20th century that it deserves explanation. In older homes with screw-in fuse boxes, a blown fuse was a common inconvenience. Replacement fuses weren't always immediately available, and some manuals, particularly those aimed at rural households in the 1930s and 40s, mentioned placing a copper penny behind a blown fuse as a temporary bypass. The penny, being a conductor, would complete the circuit. The reason this is documented in survival and emergency sections is that it was genuinely done as a last resort during extended outages, particularly in isolated areas. The reason it's dangerous is that fuses exist to blow. They're a safety mechanism. Bypassing one means the wiring itself becomes the weak point, and house fires are the predictable result. This entry belongs here not as a recommendation, but as a reminder of how differently risk was calculated in an era before circuit breakers were standard in residential construction. Rural electrification in the United States was still expanding through the 1930s and 1940s. Millions of homes got their first electrical connections during this period, and the infrastructure was often rudimentary by modern standards. In that context, the penny trick was a desperate stopgap, not a casual shortcut. Old manuals sometimes carried knowledge that was reasonable for its time and hazardous by current standards. Worth knowing the difference, and worth being glad that modern electrical systems no longer put people in situations where that kind of gamble seemed like the only option. Trick 10. Vinegar for cleaning and disinfecting. Vinegar is one of those things that appears so often in old household manuals that you almost start tuning it out. And then you remember that it actually works. White distilled vinegar, with its acetic acid content of around 5%, was used in household cleaning guides from at least the early 19th century onward. Old manuals listed it as a surface cleaner, a glass cleaner, a fabric softener alternative, a mineral deposit remover, and, in diluted form, a skin rinse for minor irritation and sunburn. Its disinfecting properties are real but limited. At 5% acidity, vinegar can kill some bacteria on surfaces, but it's not effective against all pathogens and is nowhere near as reliable as bleach or alcohol for genuine disinfection. Old manuals that described it as a disinfectant were operating with the knowledge available at the time, which didn't always distinguish between cleaning and sterilizing. What it's excellent for: descaling kettles and pipes, cleaning windows without streaks, removing hard water stains, and neutralizing certain odors. It also works as a fabric rinse to remove soap residue during laundry, which old manuals often recommended in place of commercial fabric softeners that weren't yet widely available. If a supply disruption left you without commercial cleaning products, a few gallons of white vinegar would carry you a long way. It stores indefinitely, it's inexpensive in bulk, and it has a wide enough range of applications to be genuinely useful across the household rather than just in one context. Old preparedness manuals treated it as a core staple, not a specialty item, and that framing is probably worth revisiting. Trick 9. How to keep food cold without a refrigerator. Pre-refrigeration household manuals had extensive sections on food storage because they had to. Iceboxes were common in urban areas through the early 20th century, but rural households and anyone without ice delivery had to rely on other methods. Root cellars were the main solution. Underground storage maintained a relatively stable temperature year-round by leveraging the insulating properties of the surrounding soil. Temperatures in a properly constructed root cellar typically stayed between 32 degrees Fahrenheit and 40 degrees Fahrenheit, 0 degrees Celsius to 4 degrees Celsius, which slows bacterial growth significantly. Old manuals provided detailed instructions for positioning root cellars on the north side of a structure at specific depths, with ventilation to prevent humidity buildup. For shorter-term cooling without ice, wet cloth evaporative cooling was also documented. Wrapping perishables in damp burlap or cloth and placing them in a shaded, ventilated area allowed evaporative cooling to lower the temperature around the food. This was particularly noted in dry climate regions of the American Southwest, where low humidity makes evaporative cooling more effective. Old manuals also included guidance on food prioritization during cooling failures, which foods spoiled fastest and needed to be used or preserved first, and which could be safely kept at room temperature for longer than most people assumed. Hard cheeses, cured meats, whole uncut fruits and root vegetables, dried grains, and fermented items were consistently listed as the most resilient. Fresh meat and dairy were always first on the list of things to deal with immediately. These aren't quaint curiosities, they're workable techniques that rely on no electricity and no manufactured inputs. A multi-day power outage makes them relevant again very quickly. Anyone who lived through an extended outage without a plan knows exactly how fast that window of time closes. Trick 8. Making a lamp from cooking oil. Oil lamps predate electric lighting by thousands of years, and old household manuals from the late 19th and early 20th century still included instructions for improvised oil lamps, particularly in sections on emergency preparedness and rural living. The basic design requires a container, a jar, a tin, or even a hollowed turnip in truly austere circumstances, filled with cooking oil, with a wick made from cotton string, a strip of cloth or twisted paper running down into the oil with a small portion held above the rim. The wick draws oil up through capillary action, and the flame burns off the vapors, not the wick itself. Olive oil burns cleanly and produces very little smoke. Vegetable oils work as well. Animal fats, lard, tallow also work and were historically the most common fuel. The old manuals noted that the wick should be kept trimmed to about a 1/4 inch above the oil surface to prevent excess smoking and to maintain a steady, controlled flame. Some manuals from the late 1800s included variations using a cork or small piece of tin with a hole punched through it as a wick holder, which kept the wick centered and at the correct height without requiring the wick to be propped manually. It's a small detail that makes the improvised lamp significantly more stable and practical for extended use. This requires a flame to start it and adult supervision to maintain it, but it provides a reliable, functional light source that can run for hours on very little oil. Worth knowing if candles run out, and worth having the materials ready before they do. Trick 7. The pressure bandage from a torn sheet. Modern first aid courses teach the tourniquet and the hemostatic dressing. Old household first aid manuals, many of which were written by or in consultation with military medical personnel following both world wars, taught improvised pressure bandaging from whatever fabric was available. Torn strips of clean cotton sheeting, folded into thick pads and bound tightly over a wound, were the standard emergency response to serious bleeding before professional medical help could be reached. The manuals were specific about technique. Apply direct pressure first, hold it, then wrap the binding firmly enough to maintain pressure, but not so tight as to cut off circulation entirely below the wound site. Old manuals also included guidance on which types of fabric held up best. Tightly woven cotton was preferred for bandaging because it didn't shed loose fibers into the wound the way loosely woven material did. Linen was considered even better where available. Synthetic fabrics weren't yet a factor in the era when most of these guides were written. In the absence of proper medical supplies, a clean piece of linen, pressed firmly and bound securely, has saved more lives than any number of elaborate remedies. Red Cross Home Care Pamphlet, circa 1942. The manuals also addressed what to do while waiting for help. Keep the injured person still, keep the wound elevated above the heart where possible, and do not remove the bandage to check the wound. If blood soaked through, add more material on top rather than disturbing the clot forming underneath. That last point is still current medical guidance. Some things don't improve on the original. Trick 6. Using wood ash for soap making. Wood ash and water produce lye, potassium hydroxide, which, combined with animal fat, produces soap. This process is documented in household manuals going back centuries, but it remained in American and European homesteading guides well into the 20th century, particularly in regions where commercial soap wasn't always accessible. The process involves soaking wood ash in water over several days to produce lye water, then heating it with rendered animal fat in careful ratios until saponification occurs. The result is a soft, somewhat caustic soap that works effectively for laundry and general cleaning. Hardwood ash, oak, hickory, maple, produces stronger lye than softwood ash, a detail the old manuals specified because it affects the final soap quality significantly. Getting the ratios right matters. Lye is corrosive. Old manuals included safety precautions, gloves, avoiding steam inhalation, testing lye concentration with a raw egg. It should float, not sink. The egg test is a genuine historical technique for estimating lye concentration, still cited in traditional soap-making guides today. The soap produced this way is functional, but not refined. It's soft, rather than hard, closer to a gel than a bar, and has a distinctly different texture from commercial soap. Old manuals were upfront about this. They weren't promising luxury. They were providing a workable substitute that kept hands clean and laundry sanitary when nothing else was available. This is not a fun weekend project skill. It's a practical one for extended situations where hygiene supplies run low, and where animal fat and wood ash are the two most available inputs, which, in a homesteading or grid-down context, they very often are. Trick 5. Tallow as a skin protectant and rust preventer. Rendered animal fat, specifically beef tallow, shows up in old household manuals in contexts that would surprise most people today. It wasn't just for soap or cooking. It was a multi-purpose protective coating. Manuals from the late 19th and early 20th century recommended applying a thin layer of tallow to tool blades, saw blades, and iron cookware to prevent rust. This worked because fat creates a barrier against moisture and oxygen, the two things iron needs to corrode. A lightly tallow-coated cast iron skillet stored in a dry place could go years without rusting. The same principle applied to hand tools, garden implements, and any iron or steel surface that wasn't in daily use. The same manuals also listed tallow as a skin protectant for cracked hands, windburned skin, and chapped lips. Before petroleum jelly became widely available after the 1870s and cheap by the early 20th century, tallow was the practical alternative. Some old manuals suggested adding a small amount of beeswax to make a harder, longer-lasting version suitable for boots and leather goods. Tallow-based products have seen something of a quiet revival in recent years among people interested in traditional homesteading. The old manuals were ahead of the curve, which is a strange thing to say about a book from 1908, but a lot of what's marketed as new and innovative in the wellness and preparedness space today is genuinely just a repackaged version of what people were doing before industrial chemistry gave everyone a cheaper alternative. Trick 4. Navigation by indoor shadows. This one sounds strange until you think about what it actually means in a survival context. Old preparedness manuals, particularly civil defense guides from the mid-20th century, included sections on basic navigation without instruments, and a few documented techniques for determining approximate compass direction using shadow movement indoors through windows. The principle works like this. In the northern hemisphere, sunlight through a south-facing window casts shadows that move from west to east across the floor throughout the day, mirroring the sun's arc. If you know which window faces which direction, you can track the shadow's movement to establish time of day and cardinal direction. More practically, the guides noted that in an unfamiliar building during an emergency, after a structural event, during a blackout, or when disoriented, identifying which windows receive morning versus afternoon light can quickly establish east-west orientation without any tools at all. Morning light comes from the east, afternoon light from the west. That's enough to orient yourself in any building with windows, regardless of whether you have a compass, a phone, or any other navigational aid. Civil defense manuals from the 1950s and 60s were particularly thorough about this kind of low-technology situational awareness, because they were written for scenarios in which technology had failed entirely or become inaccessible. The assumption embedded in those guides, that you might need to function with nothing but your own observation and reasoning, produced some of the most practically useful content those books contained. It's the kind of observational skill that costs nothing to develop and works entirely on physics. Old manuals were full of these. People who wrote them understood that tools get lost, break, or run out of batteries. Observation doesn't. Trick 3. Baking soda as an antacid, fire suppressant, and cleaning agent. If a single ingredient deserves its own section in every emergency preparedness discussion, it's sodium bicarbonate. Baking soda. Old household manuals listed it under first aid, kitchen safety, and general cleaning, sometimes all three sections, because it genuinely belongs in all of them. As an antacid, a half teaspoon dissolved in half a glass of water was the standard home remedy for heartburn and acid indigestion in household first aid sections going back to the early 1900s. This is still medically recognized as effective for temporary relief of mild symptoms, though old manuals sometimes recommended quantities higher than current guidance suggests is wise for regular use. As a fire suppressant, baking soda smothers grease fires by releasing carbon dioxide when heated, displacing the oxygen the fire needs. Kitchen safety sections in mid-20th century household manuals commonly recommended keeping an open box near the stove. Throwing water on a grease fire, by contrast, causes the fire to expand dramatically, a fact those same manuals warned against explicitly. As a cleaner, mixed into a paste with water, it works as a mild abrasive for surfaces, pots, and even teeth. Old dental hygiene sections in some household manuals listed baking soda as an acceptable tooth powder. The American Dental Association confirmed in modern research that it's mildly effective at removing surface stains. It was also listed in some manuals as a deodorant alternative, applied dry to underarms, and as a treatment for mild skin irritation and insect stings, where its alkalinity helps neutralize the acidic compounds in certain venom. That's a lot of work for something that costs almost nothing and keeps indefinitely in a sealed container. One item, at least 5 completely different emergency applications. Old manuals loved efficiency like that, and baking soda was one of their favorite examples of it. Trick 2. Sprouting seeds for nutrition during food scarcity. During extended periods of food shortage, maintaining nutritional intake becomes as important as maintaining caloric intake. And the two are not the same thing. Old wartime household manuals, particularly those produced in Britain during World War II food rationing, included sections on growing food in limited space and time. Seed sprouting, growing bean sprouts, lentil sprouts, or grain sprouts in a jar on a windowsill, was highlighted as a way to produce fresh, vitamin-rich food within days, using only dried legumes, water, and a container. Sprouted seeds contain higher levels of certain vitamins, particularly vitamin C, than their unsprouted equivalents, which made them a practical anti-scurvy measure in the absence of fresh produce. When fresh vegetables became scarce in the winter of 1942, many families in London were keeping jars of sprouting lentils on their kitchen windowsills. It was practical, It required no garden, and it kept children from getting scurvy. Oral history account, Imperial War Museum archive. The process is straightforward. Rinse dried lentils, beans, or wheat berries, soak them overnight in water, drain them, and then rinse and drain them again twice daily, keeping the jar tilted at an angle to allow airflow and drainage. Within 3 to 5 days, edible sprouts are ready. No soil, no garden space, no special equipment beyond a jar and a piece of cloth or mesh secured over the mouth. The wartime manuals also noted which seeds sprouted most reliably and quickly. Lentils and mung beans were consistently recommended because they required no special treatment and produced edible sprouts within a predictable time frame. Wheat berries were also commonly used and produced sprouts with a slightly sweet flavor that worked in both savory and cooked applications. Modern preppers have rediscovered this technique, but the wartime household manuals had it down with characteristic no-nonsense precision decades before it became a health food trend. Nutritional science caught up with folk knowledge on this one, which is a reasonably satisfying outcome. Trick 1. The closed room heating method. The final trick is one of the most deceptively simple, and it comes directly from cold climate household manuals and civil defense heating guides from the mid-20th century. In the event of heating failure during winter, consolidate everyone into the smallest interior room of the house and close it off from the rest of the structure. Body heat is not insignificant. A resting adult generates roughly 80 watts of thermal energy, about the same as an old incandescent light bulb. Multiple people in a small, well-insulated room will raise the ambient temperature meaningfully within a few hours, simply by being there. Add pets, add blankets, and the effect is more pronounced. Old manuals specified interior rooms, no exterior walls, because exterior walls lose heat to the outside much faster than interior partition walls. They also recommended hanging blankets or heavy fabric over doorways to reduce air movement and blocking any gaps or drafts at window frames with rolled towels or cloth. A bathroom or interior hallway, sealed properly, holds warmth far better than a bedroom with 2 exterior walls and single-pane windows. This technique was applied extensively in bombed and damaged buildings in European cities during World War II, where heating systems were often the first infrastructure to fail. Civil defense guides from that period were specific and practical. Pick the room, seal it as well as you can, put everyone in it, and use blankets, coats, and available insulation materials generously. They also recommended against opening the door repeatedly. Every time a warm room exchanges air with a cold corridor, the accumulated warmth is lost faster than people tend to expect. Once you've chosen the room and sealed it, the goal is to disturb that sealed environment as little as possible. It costs nothing, requires nothing, and works on simple thermodynamics. Exactly the kind of thing old household manuals were made for. The people who wrote those old manuals weren't preparing for the apocalypse. They were preparing for a Tuesday in February when the pipes froze, or a week in summer when the power went out, or a decade in which supply chains were genuinely unreliable. They wrote down what worked, they kept it simple, and they expected the reader to be a capable adult. That assumption that you're capable, that you can handle real information, that practical knowledge is worth having even if you never need it, is maybe the most useful thing in those old books. A lot of modern preparedness content treats the audience like they need to be protected from complexity. The old manuals didn't do that. They gave you the information, they told you the risks where they existed, and then they trusted you to make your own decisions. That approach produced some genuinely useful knowledge that's been sitting in attics and estate sales for decades, waiting for someone to dust it off. If this video gave you something worth knowing, hit like and subscribe. There's a lot more in those old manuals, and we're just getting started.